My family expected me to house my sister's family for free, so I did this and cut them off. I always knew I was on my own. That was something I figured out at a young age. It wasn't a bitter realization, not at first. It was just the truth. Growing up, I watched my older brother, Alex, get everything handed to him. A brand new car at 16, full college tuition paid for, and vacations to Europe to find himself. Meanwhile, I worked after school to afford my used car, fought for every scholarship I could get, and never once had a trip that wasn't a family obligation. It wasn't that my parents didn't love me. It was just that Alex mattered more, and I had accepted that. Or at least, I thought I had. Now, at 35, I had finally done something for myself. I bought a house. My own house. No one had helped me. No one had given me a handout. Every cent of that down payment came from me, from years of working, saving, and being smart with my money while everyone else lived recklessly, knowing they always had a safety net. I didn't have a safety net, and honestly, that's why I succeeded. But when my family found out, they weren't happy for me. They were furious. It started with a dinner at my parents' house. The usual gathering. Alex, his wife, their 3 kids running around, my mom fawning over them while my dad nodded along to whatever Alex was saying. It had been years since I had walked into these dinners expecting anything to be about me. But this time, I actually had news to share. I had just signed the papers that afternoon. The house was officially mine. I wasn't looking for a huge reaction, but I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd get a congratulations. Instead, the moment I said the words, "I bought a house," the entire room fell silent. Not a good kind of silence. Not the kind where people are letting your words sink in. The kind where you know, immediately, that you just said something that ruined their plans. My mom was the first to react. "You?" she asked, like she had misheard me. I forced a small smile. "Yeah, me." My dad set his fork down, staring at me like I had just announced I was moving to another planet. "What kind of house?" I hesitated. I should have known better. "It's a small place," I said carefully. "Just outside the city. Cozy. 2 bedrooms. A nice little garden." The reaction was instant. Alex's head snapped up so fast that I thought he might get whiplash. His wife, Emily, looked suddenly interested in the conversation for the first time that night. My mom gasped like I had just told her I was selling my soul. And then my dad spoke. "2 bedrooms," he repeated. "That's it." I frowned. "Yeah, it's just me, Dad. I don't need anything big." He exchanged a glance with my mom. And that's when I felt it, that shift in the room. The way Alex suddenly seemed tense, the way Emily's grip on her wine glass tightened, the way my mother's lips pursed like she was holding something back. I should have walked away right then, but I didn't. I sat there, waiting for whatever the hell was coming next. And when it finally came, I almost laughed out loud at the sheer audacity of it. My mom cleared her throat, smoothing out an invisible wrinkle in her blouse. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice soft, calculated. "That's lovely. Really. But don't you think you should have talked to us first?" I blinked. "Talk to you?" She nodded. "Before making such a big decision." A sharp, cold laugh almost slipped out, but I swallowed it down. "Mom, it's my house. My money. My decision." She sighed. "Of course. But, honey, you know how hard things have been for Alex and Emily." And there it was. The real reason they were upset. This wasn't about me buying a house. This was about the fact that it wasn't for them. I glanced at my brother. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at his plate, jaw tight, the muscles in his neck stiff like he was trying not to explode. Emily, however, she was looking right at me. And I knew that look. I had seen it before. That look of expectation. The look of someone who assumes things will go their way. Because they always have. I let out a slow breath, leaning back in my chair. "Let me guess," I said, my voice sharp now. "You all thought I was buying a house for Alex and his family." My mom visibly relaxed as if I had finally caught up. "Well, sweetheart, think about it. You're single. You don't need all that space. And poor Alex." "Mom." My voice was flat. "You cannot be serious." Alex finally spoke up. "I mean, come on, man," he said, his voice just the slightest bit annoyed, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "You know how tight things are for us. The kids are growing up, and our apartment is a shoebox. You don't even have kids. Why wouldn't you help?" I stared at him, then at my parents, then back at him. I wasn't even angry at first. I was just stunned. Stunned that they actually thought this was normal. That this was just the logical next step. That, somehow, my years of work and sacrifice had all led up to this moment where I was supposed to just hand it over. Like it was owed to them. Like I was just the supporting character in their story. I shook my head slowly. "No." The word was small, but it might as well have been an explosion. The second it left my mouth, my mother gasped, Alex stiffened, and my father's face darkened like I had just disgraced the family name. No, my mom echoed, like she had never heard the word before. I met her eyes. No. And for the first time in my life, I meant it. The air in the dining room felt thick, like the walls were closing in around me. I had said one word, just one simple, two-letter word. No. And yet, from the way my family reacted, you'd think I had announced I was burning the house down just to spite them. My mother's hand clutched at her necklace, her face a perfect mask of hurt and disbelief. My dad leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose like he was physically restraining himself from yelling. And Alex? He just stared at me, hard, like he couldn't believe I had just denied him something. Because in his mind, that wasn't how things worked. He asked. He expected. He received. But not this time. My mom was the first to break the silence. She smiled too tight, too forced, like she was trying to keep control of the situation before it spiraled. Honey, she said, her voice coated in that fake, careful calm she always used when she was trying to guilt me into something. I think you're misunderstanding us. I raised an eyebrow. Am I? She nodded. Of course. No one is saying you have to give the house away. But wouldn't it be nice to help your brother? Just for a little while. There it was. The bait and switch. They couldn't demand it outright. So, instead, they'd present it as a favor. A small, reasonable request, one that I'd look selfish for denying. I shook my head. No. My father exhaled sharply, muttering under his breath. Alex rubbed his face, looking more irritated by the second. Then, finally, Emily spoke up, and her voice was like nails on a chalkboard. Oh, come on, Jake, she sighed, swirling the wine in her glass like this conversation was wasting her precious time. You know how hard it's been for us. Rent is insane. The kids barely have space. This house could literally change our lives. I blinked. Change their lives. Right. Because I didn't have a life worth prioritizing. I felt it then, the slow, simmering anger bubbling beneath my skin. Not just because of what they were saying now, but because of what it meant. It meant that they never saw me as a person. It meant that, in their eyes, my hard work wasn't for me, it was for them. I had spent years scraping, saving, sacrificing, because I knew that if I messed up, there was no backup plan. And now, when I had finally earned something of my own, they expected me to hand it over like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. I set down my fork, pushed my chair back, and stood up. No. Again. Firm. Final. And that's when Alex exploded. You're a selfish little prick, you know that? He snapped, standing up so fast his chair nearly tipped over. I tilted my head, unbothered. For not giving you a house? He scoffed. It's not just a house, Jake. It's family. That's what you don't get. Families help each other. But I guess you're too busy being a self-righteous asshole to care. I laughed. Actually laughed. Because it was almost funny how easily the roles had flipped. How quickly I had gone from the responsible, hard-working sibling to the selfish one, just because I had dared to say no. I turned to my parents, expecting at least one of them to tell Alex to calm down, to remind him that this was my house, my money, my choice. But instead, my father just nodded. My mother sniffled dramatically, like they agreed, like they thought I was being cruel for refusing. And that's when I realized something. They had never expected me to say no. Not once. Because in their eyes, I wasn't an equal in this family. I was a resource. And now that the resource was refusing to be used, they didn't know how to handle it. I turned to Alex, meeting his glare head on. You want help? I asked, my voice even. Try getting a job that covers your bills instead of expecting me to fix your problems. His face darkened. You smug little. I held up a hand. Save it. Then, I turned to my parents. I'm not giving them my house. I'm not letting them live in it. Not for free. Not for cheap. Not at all. My mom gasped. Jake, please? No. Alex slammed his fist on the table. You're unbelievable. I scoffed. No, Alex. You are. Silence. And then, my dad spoke. And what he said, it changed everything. If you don't help your brother, don't expect us to help you when you need it. The words landed heavily, each one like a nail in a coffin. And for a second, I almost laughed again, because the irony of that statement was almost too much to handle. I set my hands on the back of my chair, leaning slightly forward. When have you ever helped me? I asked, my voice quieter now. My dad frowned. What are you talking about? I smiled. A cold, knowing smile. When I was struggling to afford college, where were you? Silence. When I was working 2 jobs just to keep my apartment, where were you? More silence. When I needed help, when I needed support, where the hell were you? I could see it, the way my father's mouth opened and closed, The way my mom squirmed in her seat. Because they had no answer. Because they knew the truth. They had never helped me. Not once. I had done everything alone. And now they were acting like I owed them something? I let out a slow, bitter chuckle. That's what I thought. Then I grabbed my coat, straightened up, and looked at them one last time. I hope you enjoy your dinner. And then I walked out the door. I didn't check my phone that night. I knew what I'd find. Missed calls. Angry texts. A guilt-tripping message from my mom about how I was breaking the family apart. But as I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, I realized something. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel anything at all. Because the truth had finally sunk in. I was never really part of this family. I was just useful to them. And now that I wasn't, they had no idea what to do with me. But that wasn't my problem anymore. The drive home was silent. No music. No radio. Just the low hum of the engine and the distant rush of cars passing on the highway. My hands were steady on the wheel, my breathing slow and even. But inside, something felt different. Not broken. Not even angry. Just done. For years, I had walked into that house, sat at that dinner table, and accepted my place in the family. I had let them minimize me, turn me into the one who never asked for anything, the one who always handled things on his own. Because if I didn't complain, if I didn't make waves, at least I got to be part of something, right? But tonight had ripped that illusion away. I wasn't part of this family. Not really. I was just the backup plan. The safety net. The extra seat at the table was convenient when they needed something, ignored when they didn't. And now that I had finally said no, now that I had finally set a boundary, they didn't know what to do with me. I pulled into the driveway of my house, a phrase that still felt surreal. My house. Not Alex's. Not my parents'. Mine. I shut off the engine, gripping the keys in my hand as I sat in the stillness. I should have felt proud. I had worked so damn hard for this. I had fought for it, planned for it, and built a life where I could finally afford something that was mine. But instead, I just felt tired. Tired of the guilt. Tired of the expectations. Tired of feeling like no matter what I did, it would never be enough for them. I exhaled slowly, stepping out of the car. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow, I'd let myself be happy about this. But first, I had to deal with the fallout. I woke up to 15 missed calls. 9 from my mom. 3 from Alex. 2 from my dad. 1 from an unknown number, probably Emily. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. I didn't need to check the voicemails to know what they said. My mom's would be a mix of soft guilt-tripping and teary disappointment. My dad would be firm and demanding, telling me to be a man and fix this. And Alex? Alex's would be pure rage. Because in his mind, I had humiliated him. I refused to play my role. And to him, that wasn't just inconvenient, it was unforgivable. I ignored the calls. But I didn't get to ignore them for long. Because at exactly 10:42 a.m., my doorbell rang. And when I looked through the peephole, it was my mother. I considered not answering. I could have pretended not to be home. But I knew my mom. If I didn't let her in, she'd just keep coming back. So, with a heavy sigh, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. She looked different. Not the usual put-together, graceful matriarch I had grown up with. No, today she looked worn down. Her eyes were puffy, like she had been crying. Her lips were pressed together in that way she did when she was trying to hold back emotions. And for a split second, I felt that old guilt creep in. But I pushed it down. Because this wasn't my fault. She had made her choices. And so had I. Mom, I said, my voice carefully neutral. She let out a shaky breath. Can I come in? I hesitated. Then, finally, I stepped aside. She didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of my living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if she was holding herself together. I waited. I knew this game. She wanted me to speak first. She wanted me to offer an apology, to take the weight off her shoulders. But I wasn't playing along. So I stayed quiet. And finally, she sighed. Jake, what happened to you? I blinked. What? She shook her head. You've changed. You used to be such a good son. So considerate. So family-oriented. Oh, there it was. The subtle dagger wrapped in nostalgia. I used to be good. Before I set boundaries. Before, I refused to be used. I exhaled, crossing my arms. I haven't changed, Mom. I've just stopped letting you all take advantage of me. She flinched like I had slapped her. That's not fair, she whispered. I tilted my head. Isn't it? Silence. A long, tense silence. Then, finally, she shook her head. I don't understand why you're doing this, she murmured, her voice quieter now. We're your family. I sighed. Exactly. She frowned. What does that mean? It means, I said carefully, that family is supposed to care about each other. Not just when it's convenient. Not just when they want something. She swallowed hard. We do care. I raised an eyebrow. Then why is it that the only time you call me is when you need something? More silence. She looked away like she didn't want to face the truth. But I wasn't letting this go. She finally sat down, rubbing her temples. This isn't what I wanted, she said softly. I sat across from her. Then what did you want? She exhaled. I just wanted us to be close. To be a family. I wanted Alex and Emily to have a chance to get back on their feet. I nodded slowly. And in that entire plan, where did I fit in? Her lips parted slightly. Like, the thought had never even crossed her mind. And that was the answer. I sighed, leaning forward. Mom, I love you. But I'm not responsible for Alex's life. I'm not responsible for fixing the mistakes he made. She shook her head. But he's your brother. And I'm your son, I interrupted. But that never seemed to matter as much. She flinched again. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling exhausted. I'm not giving up my house, I said firmly. Not now. Not ever. And if that means I lose all of you, then so be it. Tears welled up in her eyes. Jake. I sighed. But I didn't take it back. Because for the first time, I was choosing me. And I wasn't going to apologize for it. For a long time, my mother just sat there. Silent. Her hands were clenched together in her lap, her shoulders stiff, her breathing slow and deliberate, like she was forcing herself to stay composed. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to me saying no. And I think, for the first time, she realized she wasn't going to win this one. Still, she had to try. Because that's what she did. She pushed. She guilt. She rewrote the narrative to make herself the victim. And this time was no different. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, almost fragile. Jake, she murmured, looking up at me with wet, tired eyes. I never wanted this divide between us. I exhaled, rubbing my temples. Mom, I know things haven't always been fair, she interrupted, her voice quieter now, her gaze flickering down to her lap. I know Alex gets more attention, and I know you feel like we don't appreciate you. My jaw was clenched. Feel like it was some misconception I had cooked up in my head, like it wasn't reality. She let out a shaky sigh. But I just don't understand why you have to make things so difficult. I scoffed. Difficult? She nodded, her lips pressing together. It's just a house, Jake. You're acting like we're asking you to give up everything. I leaned forward, my fingers interlocked. That's exactly what you're asking. She blinked. I sighed. You want me to take care of Alex. To house him, his wife, and his kids. To be responsible for them, when no one has ever been responsible for me. Her mouth opened, but I cut her off before she could speak. Where was this family loyalty when I was struggling, Mom? I asked, my voice steady but sharp. Where was this we take care of each other mentality when I was working 2 jobs just to afford rent? She flinched. I shook my head. It only applies when it benefits Alex, right? Her shoulders stiffened. That's not true. I let out a humorless laugh. It's not. She didn't answer. Because she couldn't. A long silence stretched between us. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd finally see it. That she'd finally understand why I was so done. But instead, she just let out another exaggerated sigh, shaking her head. This isn't about taking sides, she said, her voice dripping with forced patience. I raised an eyebrow. Isn't it? She pursed her lips. It's about family, Jake. I let out a bitter chuckle. You mean Alex's family, not mine. Her gaze snapped to me, her eyes narrowing slightly, like I had just crossed some invisible line. And at that moment, I knew. She wasn't here to listen. She wasn't here to understand. She was here to convince me that I was wrong, to make me feel guilty enough to change my mind. And when that didn't work, she'd make me the villain. Jake, she said after a long pause, her voice suddenly softer, more careful. If you don't do this, you'll regret it. I tilted my head. Regret what? She blinked. I exhaled, sitting back. Regret not letting myself be walked over again? Regret standing up for myself for once? She sighed, shaking her head. Regret breaking this family apart. I scoffed. That's not on me. She winced, like the words had physically hurt her. But I wasn't going to cave. Not this time. I let out a slow breath. Mom. I get it. You love Alex. You want to help him. But I'm not his safety net. I'm not his backup plan. And I'm not going to set myself on fire just to keep him warm. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't pleading. No, she was just frustrated. And there it was. She had come here expecting me to fold. Expecting me to break down and give in. And now that I wasn't, now that I was standing firm, she didn't know what to do. A long silence stretched between us. Then, finally, she stood up. She smoothed out her blouse, composing herself, and nodded once. Well, she said, her voice clipped. I hope you're happy, Jake. I exhaled, watching her head toward the door. And then, right as she reached for the handle, she turned back, her final words laced with quiet warning. Don't expect us to come running when you need us. I almost laughed out loud. I stood up slowly, shaking my head. I never have. She blinked. Like, that answer actually stung. Like she had convinced herself that I was ungrateful instead of abandoned. I didn't say anything else. I just walked to the door, opened it for her, and waited. For a long moment, she just stood there. Like she was waiting for me to take it back. To say, wait, I'll fix this. To be the one who caved first. But I didn't. And finally, she sighed, stepping outside. She turned to say one last thing, something dramatic, something loaded, but I had already closed the door. I locked it. And this time, I didn't look back. I stood there, leaning against the door, breathing in the quiet. I had expected to feel something heavy, guilt, regret, some crushing realization that I had just lost my family. But instead, I just felt free. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't begging to be part of something. I wasn't waiting for their approval. I had drawn a line, and I wasn't going to cross it for them. I walked over to my phone and checked my notifications. More missed calls. More texts. All ignored. Then, I opened my contacts, scrolled down, and did something I should have done years ago. I blocked every single one of them. And as I set my phone down, a slow, satisfied smile curled at the edges of my lips. Because for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. Because whatever it was finally on my terms. The silence after my mother left was deafening. No calls. No texts. No dramatic guilt-tripping posts on Facebook. For the first time in my entire life, my family wasn't trying to reel me back in. And at first, that should have felt good. But instead, it felt like the moment right before a storm, the eerie quiet before everything comes crashing down. Because I knew my family. They didn't just let things go. They were waiting. And when they finally made their next move, I should have seen it coming. It started with a random text from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. Cousin, hey, I heard you're going through some stuff with your family. You okay? I frowned at my phone. I hadn't told anyone about what happened. Hadn't vented. Hadn't posted anything online. So how the hell did he know? I hesitated before replying. Me. Yeah, I'm good. Why? Cousin. Oh. I just saw your mom's post. My stomach dropped. I switched apps, pulling up Facebook. And sure enough, there it was. A long, dramatic post from my mother, buried between inspirational quotes and shared recipes. The second I started reading, my pulse spiked. It's so heartbreaking when family turns their back on you. When you raise a child with love, give them everything, and they still push you away. Some people don't understand the meaning of family anymore. But no matter what, a mother's love is forever. My jaw was clenched. Oh, so that's how she wanted to play this? She wasn't going to say my name directly because that would make her look bad. But she was still going to paint me as the villain. The cold, ungrateful son who had abandoned his family. And the worst part? People were eating it up. The comments were full of support, sympathy, and righteous anger. I'm so sorry you're going through this. Some kids just don't appreciate what they have. You deserve better, sweetie. Sending love. I let out a slow breath, rolling my shoulders, trying to shake off the frustration building in my chest. This wasn't about me. It was about her image. She didn't care about fixing things. She cared about controlling the narrative, making sure that in everyone else's eyes, she was the loving mother and I was the selfish, ungrateful son. I should have just ignored it. I should have walked away. But instead, I did something I knew I'd probably regret. I commented. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a second before I typed. Family goes both ways. But you wouldn't know that, would you? Then I hit send. Immediately, the comments exploded. My notification bar lit up with replies, half in shock, half already rushing to defend her. And within minutes, my mom responded. Her message was perfectly crafted, soaked in passive aggression and martyrdom. I just hope one day you realize how much I've done for you. But I won't argue. A mother's love is unconditional. My teeth were clenched. Oh, she was good. Twisting it, making it sound like she was the forgiving, long-suffering parent, while I was just a rebellious child acting out. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, finally, I sighed, shaking my head. And I did what I should have done from the start. I blocked her, blocked my dad, blocked Alex, blocked Emily, blocked every single relative that had liked or commented on that post. Because I wasn't going to let them keep dragging me back in. Not this time. At first, it felt weird. Cutting off my family felt like removing a piece of myself. Even though I knew it was toxic, even though I knew they didn't care about me the way they cared about Alex, there was still that ingrained guilt. That voice in the back of my head whispers, but they're still your family. But then, as the days passed, something unexpected happened. I started to feel lighter. No more guilt-tripping texts. No more backhanded comments. No more waiting for their approval. For the first time, my life was just mine, and it felt good. Then, about a week later, something happened that should have shaken me. But instead, it made me realize just how far I had come. I was sitting at a coffee shop when my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I hesitated before answering, and the second I did, I regretted it. Because of the voice on the other end? It was Alex. "Jake," he said, his voice too casual, like we were just catching up after years apart. "How you been, man?" I didn't even bother responding. "What do you want?" He let out a fake laugh. "Damn, straight to it, huh? Look, I know there's been some tension, but I think we can work something out." I exhaled through my nose. "Alex, I'm going to say this one more time." I paused, letting the silence stretch between us. Then I said it. Firm. Unwavering. "No." He scoffed. "Jesus, man. You really don't get it, do you?" "No, Alex," I said, my voice ice cold. "I finally do." And then I hung up. No explanation. No second guessing. No, I'm waiting for him to argue. Because I didn't know him, or any of them, a damn thing. I left the coffee shop that day feeling something new. Something I had never felt before. Powerful. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was choosing myself. And nothing, not guilt, not family, not their twisted expectations, was going to take that away from me. After I had hung up on Alex, I expected a storm to follow. More calls. More texts. More desperate attempts to guilt-trip me back into the role they had assigned me years ago. But the phone stayed silent, and I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt like I was waiting for something worse. Because my family wasn't the type to just let things go. If they weren't reaching out, it wasn't because they had given up. It was because they were planning their next move. 2 days later, I found out exactly what that was. I was sitting at my desk, halfway through answering some emails, when my phone buzzed. Another unknown number. I stared at it for a second before answering. And the second I heard the voice on the other end, I felt my entire body go cold. It was my father. I hadn't spoken to him since that night at dinner, when he sat across from me, silent, as Alex called me selfish. But today, he sounded calm. And that was somehow worse. "Jake," he said, his voice even controlled. "We need to talk." I exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over my face. "Do we?" A pause. Then, a low sigh. "You're still my son." I scoffed. "Funny. It didn't feel that way when you were backing Alex the other night." Another pause. Then, his voice dropped lower. "I didn't want it to come to this." My grip on the phone tightened. "Come to what?" Silence. Then, finally, he spoke. "If you refuse to help your brother, then you can't expect to be part of this family anymore." I laughed. A sharp, bitter laugh cut through the tension like a blade. "There it is," I muttered. "The real reason for this call. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to warn me. To give me one last chance to fall in line before they cut me out completely." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "Let me get this straight. You're giving me an ultimatum." A heavy pause. Then, my father's voice turned cold. "I'm saying if you choose to walk away, don't expect us to come running back." I smiled. Because he still didn't get it. I wasn't expecting them to. I exhaled, letting the silence stretch between us before I spoke. "You want to know the difference between me and Alex?" He didn't answer, so I kept going. "I never expected anything from you," I said, my voice calm, unwavering. "Not once. Not when I was struggling. Not when I needed help. Not when I was breaking my back just to get through college while you paid for his tuition without blinking." A sharp inhale from his side, like he hadn't expected me to say it out loud, like he still thought I hadn't noticed. I let out a slow, humorless chuckle. "You think I'm afraid of being cut off?" I asked. "You can't cut off something that was never there to begin with." Silence. And in that silence, I knew. I had finally won. Because for the first time, my father had nothing to say. I let out a slow breath, running a hand through my hair. "I hope Alex figures his life out," I said finally. "But it won't be at my expense." Then, before he could say another word, I ended the call. And this time, I didn't feel even a shred of guilt. I expected that to be the last of it. But later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I sighed, unlocking my screen, fully expecting another guilt trip from a random relative. But when I read the message, I froze. Because it wasn't from a relative. It was from Emily. "You don't understand what you've done." My eyebrows furrowed. What the hell was that supposed to mean? I stared at the message for a moment before responding. "Oh, I think I do." Her reply came fast. "No." You really don't. And when you figure it out, it'll be too late. I scoffed. More threats. More drama. More attempts to scare me back into submission. I didn't respond. I just blocked the number and went to bed. But as I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, something about her words stuck with me. Not because I believed them, not because I was afraid, but because I had the unsettling feeling that my family wasn't done with me yet. And whatever they were planning, I had the distinct feeling that it was going to be worse than anything they had tried before. For the next few days, I waited for the other shoe to drop. Because my family wasn't the type to just give up. They had lost control over me, and I knew that didn't sit well with them. I had cut them off, blocked their numbers, made it clear that I was done being their safety net. But Emily's last message kept replaying in my head. You don't understand what you've done. And when you figure it out, it'll be too late. I didn't believe her. Not really. But I had the nagging feeling that this wasn't over yet. And I was right. 3 days later, I got a letter in the mail. At first, I thought it was just junk mail, a bill, a flyer, something forgettable. But when I saw the return address, my stomach dropped. It was from a lawyer's office. I ripped open the envelope, my heart pounding as I unfolded the letter. And when I read it, I saw red, because it was exactly what I thought it was. A legal notice from Alex and Emily. They were suing me. I had to read the letter twice before the words sank in. It was a formal petition for occupancy rights, which, in simple terms, meant that Alex and Emily were trying to claim legal permission to live in my house. My house. The house I had worked my ass off for. The house I had saved for, planned for, and sacrificed for. And they were trying to take it. Legally. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh, shaking my head. So this was their final move. When guilt didn't work, when manipulation didn't work, when threats didn't work, they went to the legal system. I flipped the letter over, scanning the details. They argued that they had a reasonable expectation of residence based on verbal agreements made between family members. I snorted out loud. Verbal agreements? As in the conversations they had with themselves? I had never once agreed to let them live with me. I had never once said they could have my home. And yet, here they were, twisting reality, trying to force their way in. I clenched my jaw, taking a slow breath. They thought I would just roll over and let this happen. They thought I would get scared, panic, and hand over the keys just to make it all go away. But they had underestimated me. Because they had spent so long thinking I was weak, thinking I would always put family first, no matter how much it hurt me. But I wasn't that person anymore. And if they wanted to fight, I'd give them one. The next day, I was sitting in a lawyer's office. I had never needed a lawyer before. Never thought I'd be in a situation where my own damn family was trying to take something from me. But here I was. I slid the letter across the desk, watching as my lawyer skimmed through it. She let out a low whistle, shaking her head. Well, she said, setting the letter down, this is a new level of entitled. I scoffed. Tell me about it. She leaned forward, folding her hands together. The good news is, they don't have a case. At all. I exhaled, feeling a small weight lift from my chest. But she wasn't done. The bad news, she continued. They can still drag this out. File motions. Waste your time. Cost you money. Even though they'll lose, they can make this process hell for you. My fists clenched. Of course, they could. Because that's who they were. They didn't care about fairness. They cared about getting what they wanted by any means necessary. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. So what do? She leaned back in her chair. You have two options. You can fight it, which we will win, no question. Or, she hesitated. I narrowed my eyes. Or, she sighed. Or you can offer them a settlement to go away. I scoffed. No, absolutely not. She nodded, smiling slightly. That's what I thought you'd say. I sat up straighter. So, let's fight. And just like that, it was war. The next few weeks were chaos. Alex and Emily had no real case, but that didn't stop them from trying. They filed more paperwork, each motion more ridiculous than the last. They tried to claim I had promised them housing in a text message that didn't exist. They tried to argue that because we were family, they had a right to live with me. And when none of that worked, they resorted to straight-up lies. Emily swore, under oath, that I had once told her my home was their home, a sentence that never left my mouth. Alex tried to claim that my parents had always intended for him to have my house, as if they had any legal claim over something they never paid for. It was insane. But in the end, they lost. Hard. The judge threw out their case almost immediately, ruling in my favor within minutes. Alex and Emily had wasted months of their lives and spent thousands of dollars in legal fees. And they got nothing. Not a single cent. Not a single square inch of my home. And when the verdict was read, I turned, locking eyes with Alex. And what I saw, it wasn't anger. It was humiliation. Because for the first time in his life, he hadn't gotten his way. And I think that finally broke him. I walked out of the courthouse feeling something I had never felt before. Not just relief. Not just victory. Freedom. Because this wasn't just about keeping my house. It was about finally breaking free from them. From their guilt. From their manipulation. From the expectation that I would always be the one to sacrifice. They had lost. And I had won something bigger than a legal case. I had won my life back. It's been 6 months since then. 6 months of peace. I haven't spoken to my family. I haven't looked back. I haven't wasted another second wondering if I should have done something differently. Because I did the right thing. For the first time, I put myself first. And you know what? I don't regret it. Not for a second.